It's not something that we as humans can control. I don't want to get into political discussion about whether it was formed in a lab or it came naturally, but for our purposes, I think it's fairly safe to assume that this is an act of God. Having said that, it does not necessarily give you an out of any contract performance that may be impossible because of the act of God. Why is that? Well, there are a couple of requirements that go into force majeure, and it's dealt with differently in different states. Some states say that regardless of whether there's an intervening state action, if the initial cause of the impossibility was an act of God or a force majeure, then in fact the contract is performance is excused. Other states say no. The performance is only excused if the act of God in and of itself is the sole cause of the problem. Well, the problem that we have with that is in Maryland, there is an act of God, of course, but we also have the governor's orders. And is the reason that I can't run over to the courthouse today to file whatever you want to file, a landlord-tenant case or a collection case or represent someone on a speeding ticket because the courts are closed? Or is it because the act of God of coronavirus 19 or COVID-19 has made it impossible to do that? It gets more complicated. Some states say if there's an intervening governmental action based on the act of God, then it's not a force majeure. Other states say we don't care about the intervening governmental action. If the causing act of the problem was a natural one, something caused by God, then we know that that is a force majeure and the contract may be voided if it's impossible to perform. So then we look at Maryland law to say, what does Maryland say? Pretty natural question. And unfortunately, there are absolutely no cases that I found or that anyone that I am aware of has found in Maryland to look at whether the act of God in itself is enough or if there's an intervening governmental action like the governor's orders, then the force majeure is excused. We'll come back to how you deal with this later, but the simple answer is we don't know what the answer is. I do think that coming out of this, there will be people and contracts that are large enough and important enough that they will litigate that issue, probably here in Maryland. But there may be other reasons to look other ways and consider what else is out there. Moving on, let's talk about what is impossible, what is not impossible. Many of us, certainly those of us like myself who have gray hair, unlike Kathleen, who's much younger, remember the tornado that ripped through Reisterstown, a good 30 years ago now, and tore the roof off the apartments behind Chartley Shopping Center. That made those apartments impossible to live in. That is truly an impossibility because you could no longer have a residency if there was no roof on your building. As long as there was no residency allowed, it was impossible to occupy. And in that case, the tenants were excused from paying rent from the date of the tornado forward, regardless of what their contract may have said. Contrast that with what's difficult. And difficult is same apartments, but you rented the third floor. In the course of employment or in the course of recreation, you wind up breaking your legs, and unfortunately, you happen to suffer an injury that renders both of your legs inoperable for a period of time, or heaven forbid, permanently. Renting that third floor apartment does not make it impossible merely because you have the inability to walk those steps. You can still pay the rent. It's still possible to get up and down the stairs, even if it's extremely difficult. As hard-hearted as it sounds, that is the law in Maryland, and the fact is that's the difference between impossible and very difficult. Renting the apartment is still possible. moving up and down the steps may be difficult, but it's still possible. With no roof on the building, it's impossible to function. Clearly now, if you're a retail business and under the guidelines of the governor's orders, you cannot open, it is impossible for you to do sales. Does that excuse your payment of rent to your landlord? Probably not, but it might. And there's other issues that we have to look at. Keeping that in mind, impossibility is a key factor in this consideration, and impossibility needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. Which brings us to insurance. Now, many of us have business insurance, and generally we're going to say that where there's no comment as to a pandemic issue or an epidemic issue, there is no coverage. And I would argue that generally speaking, that's a good read of the law. If your contract says nothing about it, your insurance policy says nothing, I would at least initially take the assumption that there's no coverage. But this is not, despite the severity of this situation, the first time we have been through an epidemic or a pandemic. And back in, we've had SARS, we've had I think it's HM1, all the prior epidemics that have spread, MRSA, have now given rise to many policies, sometimes with our knowledge and many times without our knowledge, including clauses regarding epidemic and pandemic occurrences. It's worth your time, it's worth your effort to go back into the your insurance policy and read it. If you're not comfortable reading it, talk to your insurance agent, go over what the policy says. Certainly work with your lawyer or your advisors to see if there's clauses in there. There very well may be. I think one of the likelihoods that is going to come out of this pandemic is we're all going to be thinking about what insurance will cover and won't cover in the future. The one drawback to that is because these situations, although infrequent, are so catastrophic, I think it's going to be expensive to buy this coverage, but it's something to think about. And that doesn't matter whether you're trying to enforce a contract or you're trying to get out of a contract. You want to look at what your insurance policy says to make sure that that policy doesn't cover losses. And many of our business policies will cover losses of business. You've got to look at the language of that policy to see under what conditions does it cover loss of business. Does it cover loss of essential personnel? Does it cover if there's an outbreak of disease? What are the terms that that policy covers? It's worth your time to go read your policy. And if you can't fall asleep tonight, it's an excellent time to do it. But I suggest you should do it during the day, because you know what? You don't know what's in that policy. And that policy may give rise to some things that provide coverage for or benefits for you as we move through this period, which at this point may be going on. I think the governor is supposed to come on today and talk about lifting some restrictions. I can tell you from talking to people in Baltimore County, they're looking at essentially no real change in terms of county availability, recreation sites, schools, until at least September. Will our businesses be open before then? I think we all certainly hope so, but you need to be looking at this because we could be looking at many more weeks, if not months, of loss of business. Insurance may give you some coverage. Contracts. Well, let's talk about this if you've got a contract. And I think a lot of people have questions here that come up in a lot of different ways. If you've got a contract to provide certain goods or certain services and you can't because of the pandemic, are you entitled to payment? Are you required to perform? Again, the language of the contract is what you're going to need to look to, and you're going to need to look to it quickly to make sure you know whether or not the contract gives you an out. Conversely, suppose you're trying to get out of a contract that you otherwise would have performed. The one that keeps coming up, and I don't know if this applies to anyone on this call or not, but happy to answer questions, is what about a wedding? you've got a May wedding scheduled, and because of the pandemic, you obviously can't perform. I think there's a pretty good argument that because the venue can't provide the site, you are not obligated to the venue. What's going to happen to deposits? What's going to happen to monies already paid? That's going to be a whole lot more interesting and going to be a matter of negotiation. I think many businesses are going to want to refund those deposits, or at the very least, credit those deposits towards future events to make it workable for their clientele, because they're going to need that clientele down the road. But you've got to look at that language, because that specific language is definitely going to control. I would argue, and I think it's a reasonably good argument, that if you had a May wedding planned in Maryland, you have the right to void that contract. The reason being, our courts are not issuing marriage contracts except in cases of urgent need. And all humor aside, what is urgent need of a wedding? Well, the shortest answer is if someone is being assigned overseas for the military, they are entitled to get a marriage contract from the clerk of the court and get married at this time. Short of that, I've not seen anything really that points to urgent need for a marriage contract, but that is what's out there to look at. That's the kind of thing. Certainly any other venue that has to cancel, you'd probably get out of. The bigger question is going to be what happens to deposits. Are you required to rebook? I know a lot of people with the airline industry are having issues. You had a flight planned for April or May, you were flying for vacation or for business, that's obviously canceled, or it was canceled. The vacation portion was canceled because you can't go. Are you entitled to a full refund, or are you entitled to a credit? So far, most of the airlines are taking the position that what you're entitled to is a credit towards a future flight. Initially, that started out as a year. I know some of the airlines are talking now about extending that to a year and a half. It would be nice to get that cash back, but there's no guarantee. And I think, again, that's an area where the contract's going to control. At least with the airlines, I think we're all going to be thinking a whole lot more about cancellation insurance in the future, because it's starting to look better and better. Okay, so we are ready for some questions. And I would point out that the important thing here is, what do we do about these situations? Lawyers are expensive. Your time is expensive. And to the extent that you can, you're going to want to try to work with the other party involved in your contract to find a resolution that makes sense for both of you. If you can, you preserve a relationship with a possible customer or a possible source of business supplies, and at the same time, you find a resolution that keeps you both moving forward. If the money is justified, you may need to go to court. You may need to litigate. But the problem right now is nobody's litigating anything, because there's only emergency hearings at this point, and most emergency hearings are being done via either telephonic means or, like we're doing today, via video means. You've got to keep that in mind and look towards minimizing your cost and trying to find accommodations. And one thing that at least in my office helps is, aside from being attorneys who are litigators, both Jessica Murray and myself are litigators and in and out of court all the time, we are both trained mediators. And this is a situation where mediation may make a lot of sense for all the parties, where working to find an accommodation makes sense, unless, again, the issues are so large that you can't afford it. Kathleen, do we have any questions coming in?
Yes, actually. There is a comment from Lexi Schaefer. She is an event planner.
Yep.
She just wanted to thank you for talking about weddings, because she and all wedding industry professionals are working with their clients right now, trying to work out the refunds and this rescheduling. And do you have any suggestions or recommendations for people trying to work through some of this, whether it's weddings or other events that they had planned?
Well, it's obviously a balancing act. Um, the event industry needs money to keep moving forward. So far as we know, the government's not excusing property taxes. They're not excusing any other expenses that are out there. And at the same time, you want to maintain the relationship with your customer. Um, Again, I think you need to try to keep that customer happy. At this point, you can't even begin to predict when things are going to happen. Two weddings that I am aware of, I had an acquaintance, happens to be a lawyer, who's to get married this month. That's obviously out, can't happen. I have another friend who's getting married in July, and what they're going to wind up doing is they are probably going to keep the date and venue of their wedding in July, but they're going to move the reception to another date so that the event itself will become a relatively small wedding. And it'll be the couple, the officiant, and a few, probably 6 to 10 people, if that. They may or may not go to a restaurant, assuming that they're open, and enjoy that. But then they're talking about pushing the actual reception for their friends and family back. They're looking right now at late August, hoping by that point things will have stabilized. I think the event industry is in the same boat as every other industry, in that we don't know what's going to happen until we have robust testing, as well as significant progress towards either defeating the virus or inoculating against it. And so we're all going to have to watch that. You know, let me just mention one other thing that is coming up a lot, because we're seeing it every day, is people are calling and saying, I'm going to reopen, I'm allowed to reopen, I'll be reopening in June or soon thereafter. Can I have clients waive any right to sue me? And I think in the event industry, as well as every other industry, the answer is going to be pretty much the same, which is all you can waive is ordinary negligence, if that. And by that, I mean all industries, all of us need to think ahead and say, what can we do to make our businesses safe? By and large, my business at this point is operated electronically. And by that, I mean I talk to clients on the phone. We do video conferencing. I have now full video conferencing capabilities within my office. We can transmit payments. We can transmit papers back and forth. And as I indicated earlier, we can now notarize important documents all electronically. But as we begin to open up, we're already planning ahead and looking for what we can do reasonably to protect both ourselves and our clients and limit liability exposure. Towards that end, this morning I went out and bought, or it'll be shipped to me, a no-touch thermometer. Obviously, having on hand good supplies of disinfectant, gloves, mask. I'm not wearing a mask now, but I have one right here, is important. I don't know that getting a waiver of liability is going to make a difference if you put a lot of people in a room with no attempt to make sure that they're safe and healthy. That's probably the biggest issue.
Okay, that's very interesting thing, because you know we've never done this before, and we're making it up as we go, and we have to think through a lot of this, and that's where people like yourself, attorneys, can help us think all that stuff through, because we don't know what to look for. We do have another question from Joanne. She said, if you couldn't go on a May scheduled vacation, can the rental company give you the option to reschedule up to February 2021, but also charge more because now the weekends are higher rates?
Because you're moving into prime season in February as opposed to May. I think this is an area where we're all clutching at straws. And the short answer is, if your contract doesn't provide an out, you probably are stuck with wherever they go, unless you want to litigate it. The problem with much of this industry is it's a federally regulated industry, and there's limits on how much we in the state courts can do to deal with it. The airline industry, certainly most of the rules and regulations regarding payments, refunds, and future flights are regulated by the federal government. And I'm not making light of the cost of a $800 or $2,000 set of tickets, but the fact is, compared to the cost of litigation, they're minimal. I think it really comes down to a negotiation. People are scared. I have a feeling that once things start to get back to normal, the industry is going to react and say, you know, customer goodwill may be a bit more important than locking them into a February 2021 rental that costs them more, and you may have more bargaining position. Right now, I think people are just not really reacting very well and thinking about it. So I think, you know, we need to give some time and don't commit to anything too fast would be my answer.
Okay, well, that's a very good answer from an attorney. Don't commit, right? Okay, I have a question actually. Going forward, when we're signing contracts,
Mm-hmm.
or whether events or, you know, leases or anything, what should we be looking for, or what should we be asking to be added because of lessons learned this time around?
Well, I think the most important thing you want to look for is either insurance or out provisions in terms of cancellation. Insurance against pandemic, epidemic, unforeseen events that would allow you at a minimal cost to get out, and or in a straight out clause that allows you to cancel up to a reasonable time before the event, or in fact up to the event. If you happen to have had a March 16th event and that was the day the governor clamped things down, didn't you do you any good to have a 48-hour cancellation policy, because you couldn't have your March 16th event and you probably had paid everything up until then. So I think those are the two things you want to look at. I know flight insurance is becoming much more attractive and something we may all want to look into. Flight cancellation insurance, same thing on events. I think we really need to look at that. Unfortunately, we don't know if I'm going to arbitrarily say November, we're going to be back in this situation, because vaccines haven't gotten where they need to be. Testing is still good, but not as good as it could be. And we have another outbreak. And if that's the case, we could be looking at a modified lockdown in November. And what if you hold an event that's scheduled for November? I mean, I love Taste of the Town, but if we're booking Taste of the Town for, and Kathleen, I apologize, I don't know the exact date, but let's say it's October, I would sure as heck want to make sure that that Taste of the Town contract had an out for at least for payment of funds based on if there was a reoccurrence of the pandemic lockdown.
Right. Very, very good point, and something that we all have to think through. So another question is, if you are contracted to do work and can do some of the work, let's just say it's an accounting firm, and can do some of the work at home or virtually, but part of the contract is to also be on site for other parts of the work, and that's impossible, then what's the legality of them saying you didn't go through with your responsibilities?
I think the legality, barring anything in the contract that says otherwise, is if you do the work that you're able to do, then on what we call quantum mero, on the basis of the work done, you are entitled to be paid for that portion of the work. Now, the one caveat I would make to that is, if the work you're going to do is of minimal value because everything else has to be done on site, I would be reluctant to start the off-site work without some agreement from the client to make sure that that you're going to be okay getting started now and not getting back to it for some time. I think the other thing that's important in all of these discussions, I'm going to say it again, is as scared as we all are about what the future's going to hold, we all want to see every one of you back here healthy a year from now, doing webinars about booking your vacations and all kinds of great things. We don't know. And so that fear is working on all of us, but I think we need to remember that there will be a year from now, and hopefully all of us will be back. And the relationships that up until this pandemic we worked so hard to establish, we don't want to burn up because we're concerned about tomorrow when we really need to think about a year from now and 5 years from now and 10 years from now. Both are important, but you want to make sure that you keep those relationships healthy.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, we actually look like we are out of time, Bob. I want to speak for everyone on this call. We do appreciate your expertise and you talking us through the legal maze of contracts especially during this time. And I really do appreciate your time. You're getting a lot of chat saying thank you, Bob, and really they do appreciate all your information that you did give. So if you have any other questions or if you have some needs, you have Bob's contact information right in front of you. He is right here in Reisterstown. He's been a long time.
Kathleen,
Yeah.
I'm going to jump in with one thought, which is I want to extend a thank you to you and to Emily and to the entire chamber board for all you're doing, because my inbox is filled with webinars and meetings and events that you all are putting on. And I think it's a fantastic how much you have done for us as business people. And thank you very much.
Well, it's our pleasure, and this is who we serve, is our community and our members. So because of members like yourself, we're able to do things like this. So you volunteering your time and your brain to us. We have another webinar in 2 weeks. It will be about embezzling in small companies. It does happen. So you'll hear some real life examples of small companies that were taken advantage of by people they thought they could trust. So that'll be in 2 weeks. And we have a virtual networking event next Wednesday. So every Wednesday we have something going on right now. So clear off your Wednesday at 12 o'clock for the Northwest Chamber. Bob, you're getting a lot of chats and messages and saying thank you so much. It was very helpful, great information. So thanks again, everybody, for attending. And we will have a recording of this available shortly. If you would like to pass it on and share this with other professionals and your family, feel free. It'll be posted on our Facebook page. So thanks again, Bob, and everybody, wash your hands, use those masks, and stay safe. Thanks.
Bye-bye.